Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. So lovely to see so many of you joining us today for this webinar on creating neuro-inclusive workplaces, something that is such a passion subject of my own and something that we have been working on as an organization over the years, and how we can really live our values as an organization through the work that we do. So everything that I'm going to be talking about today is as a result of many years of our own kind of working on this and mastering how we can create this neuro-inclusive experience for people at work to get the best out of our employees and for them to have the best prospects for their careers and moving forward as well. So I'm so excited to share what I have with you today, and I'm joined online by my colleague Pranal, who is going to pop a couple of things in the chat for us throughout this. So she has got a handout for us in the chat, so you can just click on that link and you'll be able to download your handout there, which has got all the information that you need for today, and should mean that you can really kind of get involved in the slides today as we're going through. So please do download that handout, and she's going to be posting that a few times. And while she's doing that, because I know that let me just share my screen and I can get the slides ready to start going. Super. Great. So hopefully everybody can see that very well. Super. Fabulous. So, as I said, this is a webinar on creating neuro-inclusive workplaces, and I'm going to be sharing with you what we've learned over the years about how we can do this and how we're helping other organizations to do this themselves. So it's going to be an interactive presentation, as all my presentations are, because we found that to be very neuro-inclusive, getting people to co-create the presentation as we go through so that it helps hold their attention. So you will find that there is a link in the chat, which I will just pop in there now. There we go. Oh, no, I've sent it to the wrong thing. There we go. Here's the link in the chat. There we are. Or you can use the QR code, super, on the screen here to get connected. So I can see 2 people have liked this slide so far. If you're in the right place, it should say just get interactive link in the chat. That's what it should just say on the screen. It should be a blue screen saying that. So if you're there, press the heart icon in the bottom corner so that I can see that you've made it successfully. Now we've got just over 50 people online, so I'd like to see a few more than the 16 that we've currently got there in terms of hearts. So please do get involved. I promise you'll learn so much more from today if you do get involved with the Mentimeter as we go through. Pernell will keep posting it into the chat for those people that do join as we go through, but hopefully you're able to access that and follow along with us as we are going through today's presentation. Super. Fabulous. And Pernell, if you wouldn't mind popping the handout back in there as well, that would be really helpful. Super. So the aims for this talk, so I want to cover a lot today, you know, there's just so much to talk about in terms of neuro-inclusivity, but I wanted to focus firstly on the significance of neurodiversity for fostering innovation and creativity, how the prefrontal cortex and its executive functions impact productivity, to recognize and address unconscious biases and judgments around cognitive differences, and to learn strategies to create more inclusive work environments, as well as appreciating the vital role of well-being in optimizing our cognitive performance. So we're going to be covering a lot today, and I'm really looking forward to sharing what I know with you all. So in order to get a bit of an idea of who I am talking to, who's in the audience today, then I would like you to just fill out this, please. So how would you classify yourself in terms of your role? Super. You can participate. Pranal's just popping the Menti link again in the chat for anyone who wants to contribute to this too. Super. So it's so lovely to see so many managers and people working in people in HR there. Someone's just put in here that they're in education. Super. That would be kind of the other category, I think. So really, really interesting to see that that's coming up a lot. So I will make sure I talk about in terms of the workplace, in terms of education as well, because I think that is essentially important too. But lovely to see across the board that we've got quite a lot of people here from different roles. But interestingly, we don't seem to have anyone from finance or administration represented, which is very, very interesting considering we're just doing a huge piece of work with a big accountancy firm. So this is relevant even if you are in finance and administration as well. So super, really great to see all these responses coming in. It gives me a bit of an idea of who I'm talking to and how to pitch today. So thank you so much for that. So who am I and why am I talking to you about neuro-inclusivity today? Well, my name is Victoria Bagnall, and I'm one of the co-founders of Connections in Mind. And I am dyslexic, which means I'm neurodivergent, that I think in different ways to neurotypical people, and we'll come on to a bit more about neurodiversity later. Despite my dyslexia, did manage to get to the University of Cambridge to read geography, and I'm a secondary geography teacher by profession. I'm also a mother of 3 gorgeous girls. I have a 12-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 5-year-old. I'm one of the co-founders of Connections in Mind, like I said, and an organisation called The Code that works in tutoring people with executive function challenges too. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my light bulb moment now. For those of you that have come to our normal intro to executive functions, you would have heard my story. And if you've come to one of our trainings, you would have heard my story before. But I just want to kind of whiz over it again, because I think it is important that we talk about when we learn about executive functions and how life-changing it can be. And I know that sounds a little bit evangelical, but just bear with me while I explain what happened to me. So I was working as a private tutor at the time when I found out about executive functions. And I had struggled all my life with my executive functions and never known what was wrong with me, but just kept feeling that I was somehow different from everybody else, and that found it really difficult to meet expectations of teachers and parents, etc. And I was working as a private tutor with a young lady who got the highest ever score in the thinking skills assessment for Oxford University. So she was off the scale bright, but she just could not do her homework, complete any revision. She found exams extremely difficult to do. Her room was always really disorganized. She was just all over the place in terms of her organization, but extremely intelligent. And so I was really puzzled by this young lady. How could she be so intelligent, but yet so incapable of doing these basic things? And the psychiatrist that I was working on in her particular case recommended this book to me. She said, just read this book. I think it will clear up for you a bit of what's going on for this young lady. And I read it and I thought, oh my goodness, this is this young lady, but also this had been me. This had been me, and this was what was getting in the way of my success as a younger adult. And so I jumped on the first plane over to America to go to a training with Peg Dawson, who is one of the authors of the book. And I took her out for lunch and I said, Peg, we need you to come to the UK. And in her wonderful, generous way, she agreed to come over. And we had the first ever training of executive function coaches back in 2015. And it was at that training that I met my co-founders of the organization, Imogen Moore-Shelley and Dr. Bettina Honan as well. And we met and we had this shared belief that our work had the power to change the world, because we believe that knowledge of our brains and our brain states helps us to be kinder to ourselves and to those around us. So for us, it's all about helping people to understand themselves better so that they can stop shaming and judging each other for the differences that we know that are natural and normal as being part of a human being. So I'll talk more about that as we go through today. So my next question to you is this little nugget of information that came out during COVID. Okay, so I have looked for more up-to-date data, and it seems that it's around the same level. But in 2020, the Institute of Leadership and Management did a survey of managers, and 50% of them admitted in the survey that they would be uncomfortable hiring a neurodivergent individual. So 50% people were very open that they would feel uncomfortable hiring a neurodivergent individual. So my next question to you is, how does that make you feel? So we're going to create a little word cloud now. So you can pop in some emotions that it makes you feel. How does it make you feel to hear that 50% of managers Okay, so we've got frustrated, worried. Oh, it's not coming up as a word cloud. It's just coming up as some things. So I've got my settings wrong there, but that's annoying. Never mind. So frustrated, worried, annoyed, confused, frustrated, misunderstood, unemployable, upsetting, despondent, angry, disappointed and shocked, disappointed, worried, angry. Yeah, it is unbelievable, isn't it? And it is such a shame that in this day and age, what does it come from a place of ignorance? I do believe that it does come from a place of ignorance, but that it's not the fault of the people that don't have the knowledge yet. And I'm going to help share my knowledge with you today, with the hope that there'll be more opportunities to share that more widely. But I do believe that we need to really tackle this challenge head on, because there's still so much discrimination against neurodivergent people within the workplace. And I think that statistic really just shows it very clearly. So one of the things that we like to remind ourselves of at Connections in Mind is there are 100 billion neurons in our brain. 100 billion. It's a mind-boggling number of neurons in our brain, which means that no two brains will ever be wired exactly the same as each other, which means, therefore, that everything that happens to us from before we are born, all of our experiences shape our brain. And we are each a product of just not only our genetics, but also our environment too. Super. So we like to say at Connections in Mind, the only certainty about brain development is diversity, that everyone is diverse and their thinking and the way their brains are put together, and nobody thinks the same way. And so there's no such thing, I believe, as neurotypical. I think there's kind of the majority way of thinking, which kind of tends to kind of blur. It's got very kind of gray edges into kind of neurodivergent thinking. And I don't think it's as simple as kind of the black and white kind of comparisons there. I think there is very much this diversity across, and I think that all humans can exhibit traits of all sorts of different things. And that's a natural, normal part of the diversity, which is such an important part of our success as humanity. So I think it's something that we really need to value and celebrate rather than to shame and punish, as I'll come on into in a minute. So what is neurodiversity? So I'm just going to clarify a few things, because often people get the terminology mixed up a bit. So I just want to clarify that. So neurodiversity is the idea that there's many different ways of thinking and many different ways that our brains are put together. Neurodivergent are those with developmental challenges, and I hate these words, such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, social anxiety disorders, etc. People that we have in the past described as disordered, different. That's what neurodivergent, that's the kind of umbrella of neurodivergent now. And what we say is that neurodivergent people typically struggle with executive function skills to a higher extent than neurotypical people do, but with recognition that everybody can have some challenges in these areas, as I will go on to explain and demonstrate in a moment. So I would like to know from our audience, are you neurodivergent? And Pranell, if you wouldn't mind just popping the link to Menti back in to the chat for us, please. And I can see we've got the handout also in there. So if you want to download the handout. Wonderful. So it's wonderful to see that we've got some real allies here with us. By that, I mean people who don't see themselves as neurodivergent, but want to learn more. And that is so wonderful to see. We also have lots of neurodivergent people who have a diagnosis, one or two who are waiting for a diagnosis, people who self-identify and are not pursuing a diagnosis, which is still valid, right? You don't need to have the rubber stamp of a qualified professional in order to be neurodivergent. But it does open some doors in terms of some access to things. But for things like access to work in the UK, you don't need to have a diagnosis, and we'll come on to that a bit later as well. So really interesting to see across the board there that, we've got more people who have not got a diagnosis here than we do who have got a diagnosis. But we've got quite a few people who are self-identified but not pursuing a diagnosis, and quite a few people wonderfully who are here to learn more as allies. So that's brilliant too. So my next question is, I've been talking a bit about executive functions now, and I know that will be a new term to some of you. So I'd love to know, what's your knowledge of executive functions? Have you ever heard of them before? Would you consider yourself to be an expert? So I know that some of you will have come because you're very familiar with our work at Connections in Minds, and others will be new to this work. So I want to make sure that we cover off everybody in talking to you all today. Super. Okay. So we can see, and I told you I was a geographer, didn't I? So I love graphs. And you can see from this distribution that what we've got is a few people that have never heard of executive functions, a few more that have basic knowledge, but quite a few people who consider themselves to be kind of more on the expert scale, which is wonderful to see. But I will make sure that I pitch this at the entry level to make sure that we carry everyone along with us. So do bear with us, those of you who consider yourself to be more of an expert. I'm sure there's something that you can learn and have kind of reinforced to you through the slides I'm going to be showing just now about executive functioning. So executive functions are the cognitive processes, which means the brain processes, which reside in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. So it's the piece of our brain behind our forehead. And so how does it impact us and our children? Well, they're responsible for the effective and timely execution of tasks and emotional regulation. So they're called executive functions because it's about executing tasks, which means getting things done. Okay. A lot of people ask me, well, if they're so important, why don't we all know about them? And that's because neuroscience, which is the science that helps us to understand executive functioning, is a very new science. So scientists have only really discovered in the last 20 or 30 years with the use of fMRI scanners that what we thought in the past, were character flaws are actually cognitive processes. And we've only known that in the last kind of 20 years or so. So really important to remember, this is new science, and neuroscientists aren't brilliant at communicating what they've learned about the brain to the rest of us. So a lot of us are still in the dark about that. It's also really important to remember that every single person has a unique executive function fingerprint. So I go and do this training in schools and workplaces every week. So I'm doing at least 2 trainings each week. And in each training, it's very clear that there isn't a single person in that room that doesn't struggle with some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And so it's really, really important to remember that it's part of what makes us human, actually, having these challenges. It's not something that makes us different. And I think that's really important to remember. But what do I mean? Executing tasks. What does that actually mean in terms of our lives? So it impacts these things: our ability to meet deadlines, to prioritize our work to be completed, to regulate our emotions, to inhibit our responses, which means stopping ourselves from doing things we instinctively want to do. I mean, it's about organizing our belongings and keeping things tidy, about organizing our thoughts on paper or on the computer, about holding information in our heads, that's our working memory, about keeping time, about thinking flexibly as well. So the keeping time one, I always find is really interesting because I've traveled a lot. And if you've traveled a lot like me, you'll notice that different cultures have different relationships with time. So if you travel to Africa and the Middle East, you'll notice that very different relationships with time and punctuality than we have in the West. So we need to remember that our desire for punctuality is a cultural construct and not kind of innate human need there. And then thinking flexibly, we've got there at the bottom as well. So my next question to you is, which of these challenges, and sorry, it does say your children, that's because I sometimes do this presentation with parents, but which of these challenges do you struggle with? So not your children, but you personally. So you can choose as many as you like. So if we can just pop the Menti back into the chat for me, Pranal, that would be super, because we've got a couple of people asking for it there. Super, thank you. Wonderful. Okay. So as I say, do this presentation twice a week at least, with different audiences, and across the board, everybody struggles with these things to some extent, some more than others, of course. But all of these things are things that as human beings, we struggle with. So in this particular cohort of people, we can see that holding information in our heads, that's our working memory, is pretty high, as well as prioritizing work to be completed. That's our planning and prioritization, but also regulating our emotions, meeting deadlines, organizing our belongings, keeping time, etc., etc., etc. So we really do struggle with these things, and it's a natural and normal part of being a human being. So, my next question to you is, the last time you struggled, what emotions did you feel? And this will hopefully create a word cloud for us. There we go. It doesn't ever not get me, this slide. um, because these are really painful emotions. This frustration, the shame, this feeling of overwhelm, disappointment, uselessness, regret, anger, confusion. These are really painful emotions. And the reason I call them painful emotions is because they light up the same part of the brain in fMRI scanners as when we feel physical pain. So when we feel these type of emotions, we feel physical pain. And it's really sad. It's really sad to me because this is a natural and normal part of being a human being. We all struggle with our executive functioning, but yet we feel these very painful emotions about it. So my next question to the room is, what is at the root of these painful emotions? Where does it come from? What is the driving force that means that as adults, we feel these painful emotions when our executive functions let us down? We're not born feeling frustrated when we cry because we need milk. So we're saying people seeing them as not good enough, people feeling like a fear of failure, expectations from the environment, expectations of society. Absolutely. This comes from society. Society is embedded with unconscious bias against executive function challenges. It is everything that we experience since the day we are born teaches us over time that it is shameful to struggle with these things. In fact, they're listed amongst some of the 7 deadly sins. These are the things that we shouldn't do, that we should be ashamed of. We should hide from other people if we struggle with. We shouldn't ask for help and support when we struggle with these things, which for me is so sad. It's so sad because this is a thing that everybody struggles with as a human being. And actually, when we can get support for them, we can grow and develop these skills. But if we're ashamed of them and hide them, then we just internalize that, and that eats away at our soul. Yeah. So I think we just need to be really aware that this unconscious bias is embedded in our society, in everything that we do, in the judgments we make of people all the time, and just be aware of that in ourselves, and in others as well. Whew. That bit always gets me a little bit emotional. So just to take a breath for a second and get back to some neuroscience for some light relief. So let me teach you a little bit about executive functioning. Executive functions are these 3 core brain functions. And now you can go to multi-day conferences on executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex, and they can debate about, how many executive functions there are. But it's generally agreed in the neuroscience that there are 3 core functions. The brain is doing these things. So the brain is doing cognitive flexibility. So it's changing and shifting thinking depending on new information that's coming to light. It's also doing inhibitory control. It's stopping you for doing things you might instinctually want to do. And it's also doing our working memory. It's holding information in our heads whilst we're doing complex tasks. So that's what the brain is doing in the prefrontal cortex. It's not in little drawers in our prefrontal cortex. It's kind of mixed up together, but that's what that part of the brain is responsible for. But at Connections in Mind, we like to talk about these things as skills, because what we can't do is we can't kind of scan people's brains. And I don't think that would be very ethical either, to see what's going on in their prefrontal cortex. But actually what we can do is we can identify skills that people have. And we do that all the time. We do that in schools, we do that in workplaces, and we play to people's strengths, and we help them to develop in their areas of weakness. That's what we do. It's very successfully. So we prefer that approach. So thinking again about working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control, as we had on the previous slide. So those are the brain functions. They also skills as well. So you can become more cognitively flexible. You can adapt your flexibility in your thinking. You can learn to inhibit your responses to things. You can learn and have strategies to improve your working memory. But they kind of cross over these brain functions to have these other skills that sit alongside them. So for example, goal-directed persistence, which is the same as resilience or grit. Goal-directed persistence is comprised of working memory, because you've got to remember your goal and what you're working on. You need the cognitive flexibility to overcome challenges when they inevitably rise, and you need the inhibitory control not to go off and do something much easier, sit and have a glass of wine in the sun rather than getting on with the piece of work that you need to do. So that's your goal-directed persistence. I'm not going to go through all of these, but let's look at organization, because that's one I really struggle with. So organization. So in order to be organized, you need to have the working memory to remember where you put things down, and to keep things tidy. You need the cognitive flexibility to, when you want to just put something down on the top of the fridge, to think, hang on a second, I'm not going to remember that in a bit later. I'm going to put it somewhere else. And you need the inhibitory control when something important comes up and you just think, oh, I'm going to just pop this down over here. And then you forget where you've left it. So you need your inhibitory control for that. So in order to be organized, you need all three of these brain functions to help you with that. And like I said, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you'll see in your handout that you have the definitions of all 11 of these executive function skills. So executive function skills are needed at work and everywhere in our lives to get things done. So things like maintaining a regulated demeanor in meetings. We've all been in the meetings where there's emotions are running high and it becomes very uncomfortable to be in the meeting. Coping with stress of work and managing our workloads, working as a team and solving complex problems, managing our time and keeping to deadlines, and presenting to other people and putting your points of view across. All of these things need executive function skills. But what we might see in the workplace are the things that you can see at the top of this iceberg here. So you might find that you've got people at work who kind of go off on tangents, or they'll pull all-nighters the night before a deadline, or maybe they have emotional outbursts when things don't go their way, or they struggle to get their ideas down on paper. They've got a great idea they've told you verbally, but then when they try and present it in a report or recommendation, it doesn't kind of come across in the same way. They might forget things to do, so they might say, oh yes, I'll definitely do that for you, and then completely forget to do it. They might talk over people in meetings. They might be chatty and get easily distracted. They might miss deadlines, or they might just be really quiet and compliant at work, but feel really undervalued and unsupported. And below all of this, on the surface, all of those emotions and that we can see here that we had in our word cloud are coming up for these people. Okay, so they're feeling ashamed of their executive function challenge. They're feeling guilty, unlovable, fear, hopeless, isolated. But beyond that is their executive function challenges, their profile in terms of the way that their brains have developed. And that is caused by two things, neither of which are a choice of the individual. The first is their genetics. Okay, so we know that challenges in these areas are as heritable as height. So if you struggle with these things, undoubtedly your children will do, and probably your grandparents did too. Also, we know that trauma can impact our ability to do these things too. And I'm going to talk more about that later. And by trauma, we mean psychological trauma. And we need to remember that trauma isn't the event itself, it's how the brain responds to an event. So two people can experience the same adverse childhood experience or adverse experience and have different reactions in terms of their psychology into that. But that trauma can impact their ability to use their prefrontal cortex. So here's a couple of case studies for us to get an idea of what we're talking about, how this might show up at work. So this is George. So George has a diagnosis of ADHD, and he really struggles with his inhibitory control and sustained attention. He's super chatty, and he likes to stride around the room on calls and doodles in meetings, and he uses social media a lot at work. He completes work to really high standards, but the manager feels that he's not committed to his work because of all these other things above here. And so therefore he's passed over for a promotion, even though he's doing work to a high standard. It's seen that he's not committed because of those behaviors. This is Emily. So Emily doesn't have a formal diagnosis, but she struggles with her metacognition, which is her self-awareness, her cognitive flexibility and working memory. She often makes out-of-place comments at work and struggles to connect with other people and make friends. She sits alone at lunch. She always completes work to a high standard, but she struggles with the dress code. She seems kind of distant and reserved at work. And she's also passed over for promotion because she's not really kind of gelling with the rest of the team, and they're not kind of seeing her value, even though the quality of her work is very high. Next one is Kevin. So Kevin doesn't have a formal diagnosis, but he struggles with sustained attention, time management, and task initiation challenges. He is a charming and charismatic team member, but he is chronically late. He's always a bit disheveled, and he's always got an excuse, like the bus was late or the train was delayed or whatever is happening for him. He performed well, but he could do better. And his manager thinks that he's doing pretty well, and has given him a promotion. But his new manager is a real stickler for punctuality, and so he's really kind of falls out with Kevin very early on. Kevin has this crisis of confidence. Who am I? Am I the charming, charismatic, likable person, or am I this person that's always in trouble for punctuality? And it makes him feel very ashamed of himself. Then we've got Sarah here. So Sarah has a diagnosis of ASC or ASD, autism spectrum condition, and she struggles with flexibility and metacognition challenges. In this instance, the manager mentions Sarah that is late. She's late with a deadline, and Sarah feels it's really unfair because the expectations changed through the project, and she feels that she hasn't had enough time to complete it. So Sarah, because she doesn't have this kind of metacognition and flexibility, she kind of doesn't know how to handle her emotions on this. And she mutters something under her breath, like, so unfair, like nobody understands me. And the manager questions Sarah's behavior. What did you say? And Sarah loses control of her behavior. You never understand me. I'm fed up of working here. I quit, that kind of conversation. And the manager reports the behavior to superiors, saying that it was disruptive to others and insubordinate, etc., etc. And it can get quite upsetting for everybody involved when we have these situations. Thank you, Sarah, who's just put they're good examples, but quite heartrending. They really are, aren't they? So many misunderstood people within our workplaces. So there is some of the case studies, and I just want to talk about the link between the executive functions and neurodiversity and neurodivergent traits. So I'm going to simplify things make it very, very simple now, and it's very complex because we've got 100 billion neurons on our brain, so it's not like everything kind of sits neatly in silos, but I think it helps us to understand things a bit better. So when we have autism, we tend to struggle with our cognitive flexibility. We struggle to shift and change our thinking when plans change or when we have to see things from other people's perspectives. So that tends to be that kind of autism traits. When we have ADHD diagnosis, we tend to struggle more with our inhibitory control, our impulsive. We're very impulsive. We say things without thinking. We go off on tangents. We speak over other people, etc. And then when we've got a dyslexia diagnosis, it tends to be more around our working memory, making sure that we've noted down what we need to do, the action points from a meeting, getting what we've got in our heads down on paper, so that we can present it to other people. And so whilst no individual is just their traits, I think it's important to recognize that actually this is kind of a Venn diagram, that most neurodivergent people have a number of these different challenges in their executive functions, as well as neurotypical people as well. So everybody in a workplace can benefit from working on their executive function skills. So I'm going to talk a little bit about unconscious bias now. And I think it's really, really important to approach this with compassion. Because there is a lot of discrimination in our society these days around neurodiversity and people misunderstanding neurodivergent traits. And there's a lot of anger, quite rightly, from people about that because they feel misunderstood and undervalued and they've been discriminated against. But I think it's really important to remember that people that don't know what they don't know yet, and so people are coming at a place of ignorance. They haven't had the education, or they haven't been willing to listen when somebody has tried to speak to them about it. And so we have these blind spots, and everybody has them. Okay, we all have blind spots where we have a lack of knowledge about something and we don't truly understand it. And so we interpret the world in a certain way. And unconscious bias, just to define it, is a prejudice or unsupported judgment in favor or against one thing, person, or group compared to another in a way that's usually considered to be unfair. Okay, so unconscious bias is about this judgment that we're making about people, which is ungrounded. Okay. I believe, as I talked about earlier, that our society is embedded in unconscious bias against executive function challenges, and this is what it looks like in the real world. So it can be someone's self-internal dialogue. Okay, so we can have unconscious bias towards ourselves. I am more capable. Why can't I just do it? That's the internal self-dialogue of just being so angry with ourselves for not being able to do something. Then we've got a manager who might internalize something. Oh, they're just lazy. They're just not interested. The beginning of the day, someone's saying, late again, I see. Then this 360 review, the work you do complete is excellent, and that kind of undertone of, if you just complete more work. Feedback from a manager: when you miss your deadline, it impacts everyone around you. Yes, I think that there's no doubt that when we miss a deadline, we feel a lot of shame. So adding more shame doesn't solve the problem. Actually, what does solve the problem is sitting down with people and saying, okay, so we can see a pattern. If you're struggling to meet deadlines, tell me more about what's going on for you, about what and what support you need to help with this. Then we've got in a meeting, please let others speak. So if someone is kind of dominating the conversation and people are not understanding that might be to do with their response inhibition, or maybe their working memory because they're worried about forgetting what they wanted to contribute, then they might say that. Another colleague comments, I don't know why you do this to yourself. Okay, so it's as if people are making a choice to struggle with meeting deadlines, or to have that lack of metacognition. Oh, I don't know, I think I might be getting sacked, I'm feeling really uncertain, I need support, and having that real lack of understanding, and thinking people are choosing to be dysregulated. And then this one, which I normally comes with an eye roll, which is, it's really not hard to say good morning, really not hard to ask your colleagues if you're making a cup of tea. It's really not hard to make it to time on work, to work on time, sorry. And, these kind of comments, that these basic things, if someone is so good at their work, why can't they just do these basic things? Really just shows that lack of knowledge and understanding, that unconscious bias that we have. Again, I'm not judging these people who say these things. They just don't know what they don't know yet. But what we need to do is we need to work on opening their eyes to seeing that what they're doing is discriminatory and is based on their unconscious bias, and helping them to reframe these things in a way of compassion and curiosity instead. So a lot of neurodivergent people in the workplace feel some of these things, and this came for some research that was done a few years ago. They feel misunderstood, overlooked, and undervalued because of this unconscious bias that is kind of held within organizations and within society at large. So I want to know, which ones of these have you experienced? Have you ever felt misunderstood, overlooked, or undervalued, or all three of these things? Thanks, Claudette. Yeah, I can see all three coming through. So it is, again, very heartrending, isn't it? Because when we're misunderstood and we feel overlooked and undervalued, again, these are really painful feelings to feel, and they actually make us dysregulated and less able to access our prefrontal cortex, which is what I'm going to be moving on to talking about now. So thank you so much for sharing that. And it kind of re-emphasizes my resolve to work in this area and to bring about change in this area, because we shouldn't be made to feel these things at work. So let's talk about the role of our prefrontal cortex and how it, when it comes online and when it doesn't, and what's going on with the development and use of our prefrontal cortex there. So we've got the prefrontal cortex, which I like to think of as like our air traffic controller. It's like organizing our thoughts and what we're doing, and it's where we think before we act. And then we have a part of our brain called our amygdala. Now, our amygdala is our brain's threat detector. It's where if the amygdala is triggered, it's because it feels that there's some kind of threat to us and our survival. And our brain's primary mechanism, the reason it exists, is to keep us safe, is for survival. Okay, so if the amygdala think there's some kind of threat, it will go to the brain state, a dysregulated brain state, where it will be preserving our life over and above everything else. And that's where we act before we think. Okay, so it will be keeping us safe in ways that may not seem very rational. Although when you think about it in terms of like keeping us safe, then you can begin to understand it a bit better. So that's our kind of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And we'll talk about those as we go through today. So we've got this really cool hand model of the brain, which I think helps us to understand our regulated and dysregulated brain states. So if you wouldn't mind following along with me, you've got your hand up here and you fold your thumb across the palm of your hand. You've got this knobbly bit of your thumb that sticks out. That's your amygdala there. And then you've got your cortex, and specifically your prefrontal cortex, sitting over the top here. Now, when we are regulated and when our amygdala is happy, there is no threats in our lives, then our prefrontal cortex is allowed to do its job of regulating the amygdala. Our cognitive flexibility, working memory, and response inhibition is fully fledged and working as well as it possibly can. But when our amygdala feels that there's any threat at all to us, perceived or real, then it will say to the prefrontal cortex, we don't need you anymore. I'm taking over here, and we'll bypass the prefrontal cortex. We'll flip our lid, so it's neurologically disconnected. And what we'll see is the amygdala prioritizing safety and survival. So that's the fight, flight, or freeze response. And so what happens is, as you can imagine, as we are growing and developing, if our brains are in that fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn response, more often than not, that part of our brain grows and developed more than the prefrontal cortex. And so what we're able to see now in work coming out of the Harvard Center on the Developing Child in the US and other US universities, is we're able to see on brain scans that children who've experienced trauma will have an enlarged amygdala because it needs to be on alert and keeping that child safe, and the prefrontal cortex will be less developed, so it's be smaller in its mass and matter. And so that's really important to remember, that when somebody exhibits these kind of struggles with their executive functioning, often it's a result of having something really traumatic happen to them in their childhood, which means that their amygdala is always on the alert for something really traumatic happening again. And so it can be they're more likely to kind of flip their lid because the amygdala is more kind of attuned to threats. And so people that you see that are able to stay very regulated are often those people who haven't experienced so much trauma in their lives. It's really important to remember that. It's also really important to remember that, and as adults, it can affect us too. So if you think back to the last time you had a bereavement and the difficulty that you had getting anything done, just packing the dishwasher felt really difficult, going to the shops, and it's just really, really hard to do anything. That's because when we are in that kind of state of that trauma that we've experienced, our amygdala is on the high alert for, like, could there be a threat to our safety? And therefore we are not able to engage our prefrontal cortex and get things done the same way we would do normally. And so really important to remember that when we're looking at times of bereavement as managers as well, and what we expect of people when they're coming back to work when they have had some kind of traumatic event. And at Connections in Mind, we have recognized there's kind of 8 areas that the research is showing are needed to be built up in order for the prefrontal cortex to work well. So we've got safety, so that's psychological and physical safety, because that allows the amygdala to say, yeah, it's all right, we're all safe. The prefrontal cortex, you can do your work. We've got exercise. Exercise helps release endorphins, which keep the prefrontal cortex being able to do its work. Connection. That feeling of sense of belonging and love is so important for the prefrontal cortex to do its work. When we're feeling lonely, we struggle with that because our brains are pre-programmed to connect with other people. Fun is really important. So play is really important for the prefrontal cortex, as well as that feeling of joy, which is that feeling centered and feeling sure in ourselves. Calm. So yoga, mindfulness, going for a walk in nature, sleep, of course, and food. And when we're talking about food, we're talking about complex carbohydrates, not refined carbohydrates. We're talking about slow release energy throughout the day that doesn't give us a spike in energy in the brain and then a decrease in energy in the brain. We need to keep that energy levels in the brain as level and as balanced as possible. So I'm going to focus on connection and belonging right now, because I think it's a really important part of the work that organizations can do. But why is it so important to personal development? Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about neuroception. Okay, so you remember I talked about the amygdala, and amygdala is always on the alert for if there's any kind of threat. Well, the amygdala gets its information from all of our nervous system. So our whole nervous system is feeding back information to the brain, to the amygdala all the time about whether the environment is safe or dangerous, or whether we can kind of, get on with life. And so neuroception is this concept that we're kind of tuned into our environment. And if we feel unsafe, then what will happen is we'll flip our lid and our amygdala will take over. We need to remember that. So when somebody feels that they belong, they feel safe, and they're able to access their whole brain, which is what we need for productivity to get things done. But what is belonging? What does that actually mean? And how can we create belonging? So equality is about, this is a great metaphor that I saw on LinkedIn once, and I've kind of grabbed onto that. And I just think it's a great way of emphasizing the differences here. So equality is being invited to the party, getting the party invite through the door. Inclusion is about being asked to dance and partake in the actual activity of the party. But belonging is dancing like nobody is watching. That feeling that you can be 100% you in an environment and you feel safe. And that is what we want to create for our employees in order for their prefrontal cortexes to do the best work that they can. And that will have the most benefit for our organization because that part of our brain helps us to get things done. That's the productivity part of our brain. It's also really, really important to remember there's a huge distinction between belonging and fitting in. And as Brené Brown has taught us, the opposite of belonging is fitting in. So if we expect employees to fit into our culture, then we are not doing what we need to support them. They need to feel that they belong, which means our culture needs to adapt to meet their needs, okay, rather than them adapting to fit in to our society, it's into our culture. And I often think of when we say that they don't just fit in here, they don't fit in, they're a bit of an oddball. If we reframe that, if we hear that being said, they don't fit in, and we hear that saying they don't belong, that's a horrible thing, isn't it, for anyone to feel that they don't belong. Nobody wants to feel like they don't belong somewhere. And so we really need to make sure that we are changing our cultures to accommodate people, everybody, so that they feel that they belong in our organization. And that's really important for a number of factors. I'm going to try and emphasize this now. So this is the kind of self-talk that we might have if we have lots of executive function challenges. So a lot of neurodivergent people, and we work with a lot of them, have this kind of self-talk. I'm lazy, I'm just not organized, clever, fun, whatever it is, enough. What's wrong with me? I don't belong here. So these are the type of things that neurodivergent people feel all the time. But what happens is when they feel these things, they exhibit unexpected behavior. So they might be rude or grumpy or not meet the deadline or whatever it is, and they get judged by people. You get that eye rolling, you get the whispering behind the water cooler, and that makes them feel even worse, even more unwanted, alone, and misunderstood, which makes them feel more dysregulated, so their lid flips off even further, and then there's more unexpected behavior. So this judgment serves no purpose. It doesn't help us in any way. In fact, it just makes it worse for the individual who is struggling with their executive function skills. And so what we get is this negative spiral. We get this spiral of poor self-talk. It leads to poor self-image, which leads to poor performance. And then the worse we perform, the more we have negative self-talk, self-image, and so on and so forth. And so you see these patterns of people who come into organizations and their skill sets have been recognized and they've got loads to offer. And then the judgment creeps in and it takes them down. And again, and then, 2 or 3 years time, they leave because they're just feeling really undervalued and misunderstood. Whereas if we can build them up and stop this downward spiral and help them feel like they belong in an organization, we can get the best out of what they have to offer, and we can support them and to flourish and be the best that they can be. And what we want instead is a self-talk like this: I'm working on my skills, I feel understood and supported, I am enough just as me, and my team understand me. And that is a totally different way of being. And when people turn up to work every day feeling these things, their prefrontal cortexes are allowed to come online and they are allowed to do their best work. But if we judge and shame them, their prefrontal cortex will be disconnected and we won't be getting the best out of those employees. So what do neuro-inclusive workplaces do? How can we create these neuro-inclusive workplaces? Well, neuro-inclusive workplaces celebrate the diversity of employees and nurture each human brain equally. Okay, so it's about making sure that every single brain is looked after equally, not just the neurotypical ones or the ones that kind of fit into a certain mold. And we can do that in 4 key ways. First one is about having a growth mindset culture where mistakes are part of learning. If you have a culture where making mistakes is seen as something to be scared of, to hide, to pass on to somebody else, what you'll get is a situation where everyone is kind of got their lid slightly flipped off because they're like, who am I going to be in trouble with next? And oh my goodness, and we're going to be kind of in that defensive zone. But if we have a growth mindset culture where mistakes are part of learning, and mistakes inevitably happen, right? In any organization that's doing any good work anywhere, they've got to be taking risks and making mistakes. If we have a growth mindset culture where it's okay, mistakes can happen, but we have to learn from them, right? We don't make the same mistakes again and again. Then absolutely, then you get that prefrontal cortex online and they feel psychologically safe, as I see someone's just put into the chat. They feel psychologically safe and they feel able to get on with their work. So growth mindset is really important. And that's a culture, not just a way of talking. You have to live that culture. The next one is about focusing on compassion and belonging, not fitting in. Okay, so it's not about the individual fitting into the organization and amending themselves to fit in. It's about creating a sense of belonging, which is institutional. Are we making you feel like you belong in this organization? And if not, what can we do about it? And you can do big kind of studies where you're kind of working on asking that question all the time, and making sure this is a place where everybody feels that they belong, and finding out what it is that people need for that to happen. You also embed a culture of executive function skills where we talk about our planning and prioritization, our time management, our emotional regulation, our task initiation, all these kind of things. And we talk about them in every meeting. I was just in a meeting earlier today where I got distracted by something and I was hands up and I said, oh, sorry, just got distracted, sustained attention. Tell me again what you said. And we just normalize that. And by having a language to talk about these things, there's no shame involved in it. I know I get distracted sometimes. I have ADHD. I will get distracted sometimes. That's okay. But I'm working on that. And, I had something important personally going on, which meant that I was kind of distracted a little bit too. And so it's really important to be human about these things, and talking about it. It's also really important to have managers who can coach people in executive function skills development. Okay. And so what we're doing is a number of pieces of work with top institutions globally, helping them to train their managers in executive function coaching so that every conversation with a manager is about building those skills so that everyone in the organization feels held, they feel a sense of belonging and feel the sense that they're building their skills and working towards being the best that they can be, which is such an important piece of our work. And finally, it's really important to remember, as we talked about the kind of 8 building blocks of executive functions, it's really important to remember that in order to get that prefrontal cortex online, we need to look after our brains, okay? And that if we keep pushing and pushing and pushing people, those building blocks are going to deplete and deplete and deplete, and we're not going to get the productivity that we need. So a neuro-inclusive organization recognizes that well-being is as important for productivity as time on the job. It's not just about the quantity of what we do, but it's about the quality and making sure we're looking after ourselves. Super. So, this quote here from Kirkle et al. in 2019 is they found that higher well-being at work is positively correlated with more business unit level profitability. So the more we look after our well-being, the more we can make money, which is what organizations are all about, sadly. So really important to remember that too. So our approach at Connections in Mind is centered on 3 principles. The first is about connect, that sense of belonging and connecting as humans and connecting our prefrontal cortex as well. The second is collaborate, and about working together and to find solutions for that individual. So nothing about them without them. I really believe in that. So we don't have conversations behind people's backs. We collaborate with them. So we've noticed that you're really struggling to get to meetings on time. It's delaying everyone else. Can we just talk about a little bit more about what's going on for you with that? We really want to support you. So different to you. If you're late for a meeting again, we're going to have some serious words about your commitment to this role. Very, very different approach. And the final one is support. So we haven't really covered that here, but we do in our training. It takes 60 iterations of a task for it to become second nature. So we need to support people over the longer term to put these things into practice. You can't just do a talk on executive functions and imagine that everybody will suddenly then be brilliant at executive functioning. It just doesn't work like that. It takes a long time to embed these approaches in people's brains and in the culture at work too. And thank you for all the lovely comments coming through in the chat. I really do appreciate that. So please do remember, we are a community interest company, which means that we are a non-profit, exist to support our community of neurodivergent people and to educate the wider population about neurodivergent differences and also executive functioning. So that's why we exist. We're here to help, and we really do want to help you. And we can offer all sorts of things in terms of our services. So we can offer executive function coach training. Like I said, we've got a top accountancy firm, global accountancy firm, that is investing in executive function coach training for all their managers working with neurodivergent people. So this is something that organizations are already doing. We can do neurodiversity training and talks just like the one you've had today, and more bespoke ones to the needs of your organization. But also we can offer coaching. So we can offer executive function coaching and admin support to neurodivergent people. So if you have anyone who self-identifies as neurodivergent, they can get support through Access to Work in the UK, which is free coaching or free admin support from the government. And there'll be a chance in a minute to express an interest in that, so we can send you more information. Super. So just a bit about executive function coaching, although I'll go on to talk more about this in a minute. There are 4 levels of accreditation that you can go up to. So entry level at level 1 and all the way up to master level at level 4. You can look us up on Mighty Networks and LinkedIn, etc. And I have reached the end of my presentation, but I do have one more thing before we finish. I would like to hear what people are interested in learning more about, and we will send you an email after this webinar on this information. So please do fill out this poll, and you logged in with your email address, so it will tell us who's asked for what, and we'll only send you information on what you're interested in. In a moment, I'm going to, I think Pranal is going to pop a link into the chat. And she is going to, which is for our support worker PA services. So if you're interested in getting free admin support for your neurodivergent employees or for yourself, you can speak to Chantel, and she will be talking to you about that. So if you wouldn't mind just popping that into the chat, that would be really helpful. And then also just to say, if you're interested in executive function coaching, which I can see lots of you are interested in, we do have a free webinar next Monday at 1 o'clock. And so I think we need to put that into the chat as well. It would be really good to see lots of people there learning about that. If anyone's interested in the coach training or more training for their organization, please just stay online on the webinar here and I can answer any questions that you have. We've got about 15 minutes to do that. Super. So we've got the support worker PA there for Chantel in there. And also thank you so much. So just a couple of people have been asking for the slides. I'm afraid we won't be showing the slides with you. They are RIP, and this was a free webinar. If you do want to have this talk in your organization, please do ask us and we'd be delighted to come in and deliver it. There will be a recording of this available, which you can circulate, and it will be available on YouTube, so you can get that. We also do have a free handout that is in the chat as well, so please do share that around. But we do encourage you to get our services to come in. All the money that you spend on any training goes straight back into working with people who are neurodivergent, who are really struggling, through our Connected Club, to help give them a space of belonging where they can flourish and grow. So thank you so much, everybody, for your very kind comments. I really do appreciate that. I hope you've learned lots today, and I'll be staying on here if anyone wants to have a quick chat about the coach training or training in organizations. Thank you so much.